Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 133 of ASBN Live, The Case for Carbon Labeling. I'm your host, Tulasi Sivalingam, the American Sustainable Business Network Senior Manager of Events and Programming. I, like many of you, am a consumer looking to minimize my ecological footprint. So I'm excited about the practice of carbon labeling being widely adopted, so I know where my money is going. I'm thrilled to hear from ASBN's very own Michael Green and our members at Planet Forward, represented by Kayalin Akens-Irby, and ClimateTrade, represented by Kat O'Brien, who are all experts on this very topic. It's now my pleasure to hand it over to Mike Green to hear a little bit more about what here at ASBN, what we're doing when it comes to carbon labeling.
Great. Thank you so much, Tulasi, and really excited to listen into the true experts on today's conversation in both Kat and Kayalin, who aren't just experts on this matter, but are also really subject matters in the climate tech space as well. So don't think that we're just going to be covering carbon labeling here, but a wide range of other things that'll probably be intertwined to it. Talking about policy, actions that businesses are doing to meet their climate goals, as well as a consumer, what you might be able to be on the lookout for. So stay tuned to that. This is something that's come up from a lot of our members, as well as a lot of partner organizations, this idea around how do we support consumer literacy and how do we support being transparent about the climate impacts of our products and services. We're really strongly supportive of it at ASBN and trying to figure out ways that we can support our members to understand the business opportunity of being transparent about their carbon footprint and sharing this with their consumers, customer base, providers, and people in their community. So over the last 4 or 5 months now, we've been working on a business case study that will go over some of the benefits to your business on why you should be transparent about your carbon footprint, how to go about doing it, what are some key service providers that you might want to reach out to that can help you with that, some of which are on the call here today, as well as opportunities for you to get involved in the policy landscape around carbon labeling. Not to take anyone's thunder from later on in the presentation, we'll get into some of the policies that are coming down the pipeline, but there's been a lot of focus and energy specifically on government procurement and around government contracts and the embodied carbon within the products that our number one provider or number one contracts are in the country, that is with the US government itself. So we've been very closely following the Buy Clean initiatives that have been led by groups like the Blue-Green Alliance and others. And we hope to release our business case study to show support and find ways for businesses to get involved in these campaigns and take action themselves. So we're going to start out with a little bit of a call to action for folks listening in today and listening to this down the road to reach out to us if you're considering carbon labeling or it's something that your business is already doing. We would love your feedback as we think through the economic case for why someone should go about doing this, why you made that decision or are thinking about it. And we'd also be happy to connect you with some of the, again, service providers or other organizations that are really working on this. We'll have more actions for you to take down the road as we find policies in order to get engaged in. And so we'll certainly have opportunities to continue this conversation beyond today. So that's enough from me. I hope to see folks on a climate and energy working group call. It's the third Thursday at 1 o'clock in the near future. But we're going to hand it over now to our members in order for them to talk a little bit about how they're supporting this important initiative. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kat O'Brien, who manages partnerships over at ClimateTrade. Thanks, Kat. Over to you.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. And thanks everybody for being here today. My name is Kat O'Brien, as Michael said, and I'm the head of partnerships for ClimateTrade. We are a startup originally founded in Spain, now officially a US company. And we are the first climate marketplace that enables both companies, businesses, organizations, as well as individuals to reduce their carbon footprint through a variety of mechanisms. So we aim to offer really every climate solution that someone would need to reduce their carbon footprint. So some of that is education, understanding, and I think, talking about carbon labeling, if you know what footprint is, if you know what you're contributing, negatively contributing to the environment, hard to address that if you don't really know what you're doing. So we're educating on that, and then we also offer different verified reductions, as well as carbon removal is another area that we're getting into. But we've been in the carbon offsetting space for several years and have expanded that into removals and reductions. And what we are seeing in working with different companies, we work with currently about 400 companies that include some of Banco Santander, Telefonica, Melia Hotels, Lavazza Coffee. And what we're seeing in among current partners, as well as others that we're discussing with, that can include, again, corporations such as the ones I mentioned, or organizations like a Chamber of Commerce, the city government, is that there's just a growing need, a growing interest in understanding carbon footprint. I've had several discussions with business leaders, sustainability leaders at corporations, that they want to know how to track the carbon footprint, how to track what the environmental damage is or not damage, all the way through the product path. So not from, for instance, if we're talking about a coffee, from the beans being farmed and grown to all the way to when it reaches your cup in Brooklyn or in Chicago or wherever you may be. So that's something that some of this has been in Europe a little bit longer, I would say, the interest, and it's really growing a lot in the US. And so we're looking to partner with businesses, with corporations, as well as governments and associations to help make that carbon labeling front and center. So if I'm a consumer, I can, hey, I'm at the supermarket and I want to know what the difference in the footprint of these products are. So for instance, a grocery store is actually a great example. Beef or lamb have a really high carbon footprint. Doesn't mean you might not ever want to have those, but it's something good to have in mind when you're trying to reduce your carbon footprint. So if you are able to go, just like when you're thinking about maybe your diet and what if you're trying to be a little healthier, which sometimes people have that top of mind coming out of Labor Day and coming out of summer, that having the calorie count there, or having different ingredient count there, I think that that's going to be in the future very similar, where the same way that you might think about what nutrients are in something that you're purchasing at the store or at a restaurant, you might be thinking about what the carbon footprint is of this product. So, if I can buy, I need some new running shoes, and I can buy, recycled running shoes from Hoka or from Nike, versus ones that have a much higher carbon footprint. That's something that I, as a consumer, may want to keep in mind. And that's something we're seeing in conversations with companies, that they have a demand from their consumers to offer sustainable products that have less of a negative impact on the earth. And so sometimes we're working with companies for them to help reduce their footprint directly, or to offset any negative footprint that they may have. Sometimes, in the short term, they may not be able to do everything they hope to, say 3 to 5 to 7 years down the line. But sometimes they're also looking to offer these services to their consumers. So as an example, we work with Banco Santander and MasterCard. And so a client of Banco Santander in Spain, currently just in Spain, but we'll be expanding that to other countries, can look at what purchases, what transactions they've made through their Santander account, and it has the carbon footprint associated with those. So at the end of the month, it will ask if the person would like to offset their transactions. So, and it's got, the carbon footprint of those. So it's kind of a different sort of carbon labeling. It's after the fact, but we're also offering some tips and education about ways to reduce that. So, okay, I already did this last month. I already consumed X, Y, Z and electricity or water, but here are some tips on ways that I can reduce that. And, especially for with high energy costs right now, even, aggravated by the war between Russia and Ukraine, people are really thinking about not only from a sustainable standpoint, but from a financial standpoint, ways to reduce energy expenditures. So, I think this carbon labeling is something that's going to grow and probably go beyond CO2 in the future to other aspects of the footprint. And we're looking to help any company, any association, local or regional government to be able to provide that labeling, to be able to calculate what that footprint is according to the needs. And so that can then reach the end consumer. So, my parents in Iowa can, when they're going to the grocery store, they can be at Hy-Vee and think about, oh, well, maybe we want to buy this product instead, or I'm, looking to buy a new couch and there's a different footprint based on that. I've seen it popping up recently with travel quite a bit. And when I purchased a flight recently, which we all know there's the carbon footprint associated with that, but different flight options had a different amount of CO2 associated with them, not only based on the connection or the distance flying, but also based on the fleet that the airlines had. So, I think that there's a really strong demand for knowledge among consumers. And so that is getting pushed up to businesses and then, from a governmental standpoint, that interest has been there. There's a need for information. And so the easier we can make it for people to access this knowledge, this education, the better it's going to be from actually making a difference. And so we're trying to do that at ClimateTrade, and I will put in the chat here our website as well as my information should anybody be looking to potentially partner or get more information about some of our services or just learn more about carbon labeling. And I know Kayalin's going to have much more information and much more details, but I hope this is a good short primer on some of what we're trying to do and some of why we think the education around carbon labeling is going to be really beneficial to the public. Thank you so much. And I'm going to just pass it over to Kayalin now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kat. And I think it's so important just within the world of climate tech and what we're trying to solve, that there's multiple solutions and as many people as possible working on this problem. And so I'm really just happy to work in a place where we're all so supportive of each other, because that's what we need. So I am going to dive into some content around carbon labeling, what it is, what it looks like, what's happening in the world around it, and also how do you actually do it and how do you do it at scale. But just for a way of brief introduction, my name is Kayalin Akens-Irby, and I'm the head of growth at Planet Forward. We are the leading carbon accounting platform for consumer companies focused on food and beverage, beauty, personal care, and fashion, primarily focused on solving the issue of Scope 3 measurement and decarbonization, which is so difficult within that space in particular. We do that because we have the largest life cycle assessment database for agricultural production systems in North America, meaning we have the LCA data points that make up pretty much every consumer product, from the inputs and ingredients that go into them, to the processing steps, to the materials and the packaging, all the way through end of life, to really minimize the burden of data collection, calculation, and ultimately decarbonization. So with that, I'll just bring up a quick little presentation here. Awesome. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. As I mentioned, Planet Forward we focus on carbon accounting, both at the company level and the product level. I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end, but we do full scope 1, 2, 3 carbon footprint measurement for companies, as well as full cradle to grave life cycle assessments at scale. So really working on both sides of the picture in terms of the high level and the individual products. So thinking about carbon labeling, what is happening in the space? What is it? What does it look like? And has it been growing? Is it something that's becoming mainstream? I wanted to just first set the stage as to kind of what the growing trends are around carbon labeling. So just for everyone's edification, carbon labeling is really the practice of putting the carbon footprint of a product onto the packaging or into the marketing materials, saying that it took X kilograms of carbon to make this product, and I'm going to opt into carbon transparency and sharing that with my consumers. It's really important for both transparency and building carbon literacy, as Mike touched on, as well as ideally, incentivizing decarbonization by providing a system and ecosystem that can actually reward companies that are taking strong steps around sustainability. So overall, consumer demand has just dramatically increased in terms of them looking to companies for carbon labeling. A global study recently that was conducted by the Carbon Trust found that 67% of consumers today, so 2/3, are actually asking brands to carbon label their products. Without that level of visibility, consumers don't have the ability to determine between one product or another and actually make purchases in alignment with their values. So it's something that consumers are directly asking for. There's been a huge uptick in adoption globally. Carbon labeling has increased over 400% in terms of prevalence since 2020, marking a significant trend. It's happening across the entire consumer space. However, it is most prevalent today in food products, with about 86% of all of the companies that are currently doing carbon labeling being in the food industry. That's largely due to the precedent of nutrition labels, for example, which is something that people are very familiar with when it comes to, numeric representations around qualities of the products that they're purchasing. So you can imagine in the future, just as we have nutrition labels on all the food items that we purchase, we might also have climate labels across all products, but building up that same level of familiarity with that information. There's also a number of emerging regulations that are popping up around carbon labeling, either voluntary or mandated. This is most prevalent in Europe today. France has put out an eco label, which they're encouraging companies to use. Denmark is in the process of putting together a voluntary climate labeling scheme. You've probably seen the eco labels across the EU, which are not mandated, but are becoming standardized under Foundation Earth. There's also conversations in the US, both at the federal level and the state level, around carbon labeling, which Mike also alluded to. So definitely a lot coming down the pipe. And there's also a huge movement for standardization. Because carbon labels are becoming more prevalent, consumers want to feel confident that the information that they're receiving is not only accurate, but is also something that they can start to build a literacy around. So being able to represent that information in a consistent way is something that the industry is working on. Just a few more stats. I mean, one of the topic of today is, what is the business case for carbon labeling? What is the case for carbon labeling? And especially within the consumer space, thinking about what is the sales upside of this going to be for me is a big deal. Doing the measurement process of measuring the carbon footprint of your product is an extremely important step in facilitating decarbonization and understanding what opportunities you have across the life cycle of your product to reduce, and also provide a framework to create the lowest emissions products. But there's also a lot of business upside for doing this work. So consumers are increasingly looking for carbon labels and rewarding the businesses that are doing it. So huge mind-blowing statistic that I share often is just the fact that 55% of the growth in the consumer goods space for the last 5 years came from sustainably marketed products, even though they made up less than 8%. So when you think about this idea of future-proofing your business and being able to lean into the growth trends and where the growth is happening, it's happening in sustainable products. consumers are willing to pay a price premium as well for sustainability in certain instances, which making products more expensive is not our goal, but it is important to know that consumers are willing to pay more if there is any sort of cost increase related to those improvements. And we said before, 67% of consumers are looking to brands to do carbon labeling, which is just aligned with general trends of climate becoming a core purchasing decision for millennials and Gen Z as it becomes more top of mind for them. So carbon transparency is another just important definition within this space. And I think that one thing that I want to make super clear is that carbon labeling is not a separate initiative that's decoupled from a broader climate strategy for a company. You guys have probably heard a lot around SEC rules, around scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions disclosures for public companies, decarbonization, net zero goals. All of these things are what we consider to be parts of a successful climate strategy for a company. And carbon labeling is actually, if done right, a result of doing that work. So with Planet Forward, for example, we have what we call a hybrid methodology for our corporate GHG inventories, where we're doing full scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon footprint measurements for companies. And then when it comes to that scope 3, we can actually do LCA assessments on your ingredients and on your packaging materials and all of those individual pieces that are making up that scope 3, which gives a tremendous amount of visibility. And that's that same data that you need to actually do carbon labeling. So this isn't something that I want people to think of as additional to what's already being done. It's really just an opportunity to communicate to consumers about the progress that you're making and to do it in a way that's extremely digestible to them when they're walking into stores and interacting with your products. So really, this idea of carbon transparency is both internal in terms of companies achieving a point where they have full carbon transparency across scope 1, 2, and 3 and across the life cycle of their products to be able to inform decarbonization, and then also to be able to transparently share the progress and the results of that work with consumers, not only to make sure that there's accountability, but also, again, to lean into the business upsides of doing this work. So there's many carbon labels that are out there in the world today, and I'll show you some examples of those. Actually, I'll dive into that really quickly. This is a really awesome database that's been compiled by a friend, Michelle, at a company called Clever Carbon, where she's tracking all of the products that are doing carbon labeling. So you can see here, there's a whole database of different brands that are doing carbon labels and showing what those look like. From Panties, which is a sustainable, reusable menstrual wear company for women, to Oatly, which we're all familiar with, that was one of the first companies to do carbon labeling. Allbirds also has carbon labels for all of their shoes and recently did a collaboration with Adidas that was super successful in terms of launching the lowest emissions shoe ever. Corn, Chipotle, ASBN, Just Salad, who's one of Planet Forward's partners that we'll hear a little bit more about as I dive into in detail how they achieved their carbon labels and even what some of the outcomes are for them. But you can see that this work is becoming more and more prevalent across all types of products, but also does look different for many different companies based on the way they've chosen to share their information. So I wanted to quickly, going back to the presentation, dive into what are the different kind of categories of carbon labeling that we're seeing popping up, and what are some of the characteristics of those. So really, of all the carbon labels we saw, you can oftentimes put them into 3 different categories. One is a numeric footprint, where we're showing the total greenhouse gas footprint in a numeric format. So the actual number itself, you might actually see that broken down by the drivers of the underlying drivers of those emissions, as you can see here, which is Numi Tea's carbon label that Planet Forward helped them develop. So we have the total footprint of a bag of tea. We also see where that's coming from across ingredients, packaging, transport, and boiling water, which is super important, again, for this idea of building carbon literacy for consumers, but also because it really, again, just maps back to this idea of a nutrition label and being able to see what ultimately contributes to the total footprint. A carbon neutral label is something that companies can opt into, which means that you've calculated the carbon footprint of your product and chose to offset it, as Kat shared with ClimateTrade offers some offsetting solutions. And this is maybe for a company that isn't quite ready to share the total footprint of their product, if they that's not something that they feel comfortable with yet, but still really wants to demonstrate on package that climate action is a significant value of their company and something that they're working on. Lastly, there's these scoring systems that are showing up. These are more prevalent within Europe. Sometimes they're A, B, C, D, E, F, G scores. Sometimes they're color coded. These are also great, and what's really helpful about them is that they contextualize the results of a climate label for the customer as they read them and as they see them, where they can see very clearly, okay, this product performed in this way because it's green and it's an A. One of the downsides of this is that it's not granular enough to be able to really call out specific sustainability improvements that brands are making. If we have tofu manufacturer number 1 and tofu manufacturer number 2, we really want to be able to tell that, okay, this one invested in regenerative agricultural regenerative agricultural practices and sustainable, fully recycled, reusable packaging, whatever it is. We want to be able to call out those specific improvements. And if we're just scoring things on a relative basis, then that doesn't give companies that are really standing out the ability to be rewarded for that. There's also some kind of concerns around, providing red scores or low scores, because it's not that we want to discourage people from purchasing certain products. We really want to reward companies that are making improvements and providing an infrastructure for that to be the case. So let's dive into a couple case studies on some different companies that are doing this that Planet Forward worked with and how they went about that. So we'll start with Just Salad, which is, they were actually the first ever food service company to carbon label their menus. If you walk into any Just Salad restaurant across the East Coast, you'll see that there are carbon labels on their menus. If you log into their website, you can order salads with carbon labels very much there and present. And we even work together on this earth-friendly salads menu that when you walk into the store, you can see what are the lowest emissions menu items and which ones might I want to interact with based on that. And so we worked with Just Salad to conduct life cycle assessments for each of their ingredients and menu items, and to then use that information to carbon label their menus, to do call outs for low emissions items, and then also to start to use that information to make sustainability decisions between different chicken providers, for example, or different plant-based meat alternatives, really understanding what the footprint of those inputs are and which ones we want to prioritize, both within meal recipes and in procurement. So this is not only about slapping a label on something and calling it a day. It's also a framework to be able to improve continuously over time when you have, well, again, full carbon transparency. So some really awesome outcomes from the work that we did with Just Salad. Obviously, emissions reduction is a goal, both in terms of being able to reduce Just Salad's emissions that are in their control, and also be able to reduce emissions based on improving and changing consumer preferences. Increasing sales, also an important goal. One of the most awesome statistics within this is that Just Salad actually saw an 126% sales increase week over week from the time they launched their ClimateTrade menu, which is all of their low emissions menu items, which is really exciting in terms of seeing that consumer response. And this is an ongoing upside for them. Sandra Noonan is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Just Salad. She's an incredible woman, and she's on the cover of magazines and constantly being quoted for Just Salad sustainability work because they are a leader in this space. So it's not only a function of changing consumer preferences within stores, it's also a function of increasing the brand value of your company by being able to do this work. Another really awesome case study on the CPG side that Planet Forward worked with is Numi Tea. Numi's been just known for their sustainability efforts over time always, and they were also one of the first to put climate labels on package as well. This work was led by Jane, who is at Numi. And so again, we did full cradle to grave life cycle assessments for their products, understanding the carbon footprint of their ingredients, being able to call out some of the impacts of specific sustainability investments that they've made in regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture, specific improvements that they've made to their packaging, such as having a fully plant-based tea bag. And then also being able to call out end of life. It's really surprising to many people that 46% of the footprint related to tea is actually coming from the boiling of the water itself. So because we've uncovered this information, we're also able to launch some messaging targeted at consumers around how they can be involved in reducing the footprint related to Numi's teas. So you can see here that we provided consumers with, 3 main goals around how they can reduce their footprint, from trying to move towards clean electricity to the extent that they have control over that, and even opting for tea over coffee in certain instances, because tea is lower emissions. That's an exact example of how this idea of carbon literacy can start to factor into consumer decisions, because we start to understand the relative impact of things that we're consuming. So those are some examples of companies that have done this successfully and are seeing upsides from it. Many people are probably wondering, okay, cool, that's awesome, but how do I do that? And so it's really a tried and true process at this point in time. There are established standards for carbon accounting in terms of how you actually calculate the footprint for a product. So to do carbon labeling, you want to do a full cradle to grave life cycle assessment for your product. This should be done in alignment with global standards. So the GHG Protocol's Product Lifecycle Assessment Standard, the ISO 14044 series, PAS 2050. Important questions to ask any provider that you're working with around product LCAs is, what standards do they align to? Because we want to make sure that your calculations are accurate, they're credible, and they're also going to stand up over time as more and more regulations evolve in the space, and there's going to be more scrutiny on numbers. So you really want to do it right from the start to the extent possible. The next step is always going to be to commit to ongoing reduction. No work in climate should ever come along without a commitment to reduce, because that's really what our ultimate goal is when it comes to fighting climate change. So using your life cycle assessment to understand what the largest drivers are of your footprint today and how you can improve that is the next step. And committing to year-over-year reductions over time. That's another reason why a full cradle to grave LCA is extremely important. You want to make sure that the data that's being used to calculate your footprint is reflective of your exact product. Many solution providers out there today are using really high level emissions factors, maybe their averages across a whole country, for example, in certain instances, but you want to have a provider that's actually able to tailor your results to yourself. Are you using regenerative agricultural practices within your supply chain? If so, that should be reflected. You should get credit for that. You don't want to have a generic emissions factor if what you're sourcing was not generic. And that's also important when it comes to being able to understand how to reduce over time. You want to work with a partner that's going to be able to suggest to you improvements that are specific to you. So really digging in with your partner around what are their data sources is important as well. That's why our Planet Forward strength with our LCA database is extremely important, as well as our really advanced supply chain modeling capabilities, because we're able to actually tweak each individual aspect of an LCA for a customer, even if they don't have perfect data from their suppliers, to make sure that your footprint is truly reflective of your products. If you did want to go forward with the carbon neutral process, which we said is, one of the other types of labeling you can do, then offsetting your emissions against that product's production or sales each year is going to be the next step after you have that footprint. So measure, reduce, label if you want to do a numeric label, measure, reduce, offset, label if you want to do a carbon neutral label. And then, this work was all extremely difficult at one point in time. It was done only through consultants and really only accessible to enterprise level companies, because it was costly and it was time intensive. And so one of the things that I'm always excited about whenever I meet with people is just this idea that we have so much money being poured into the climate tech space today. It's one of the hottest investment areas for good reason, because we need solutions as fast as we possibly can. What that also means is that there's probably someone out there dedicating themselves full-time to trying to solve your problems as it relates to taking climate action. Planet Forward exists solely to solve the issues related to climate for consumer companies. That's what we spend all of our time, all of our resources doing. And so that should ideally be just an unlock and an excitement for the companies that feel stuck, because there's probably someone out there that's thinking about how to solve this for you. But with that, it's also important to understand the long-term goals of you and your company and what providers can meet those. So I've included just here some diligence questions, for example, as to some things that you might want to think about or consider when looking into a partner. Does this provider utilize life cycle assessment data that is specific to the food and beverage sector or to the consumer sector? This is specific to food in this instance. That's highly granular and able to account for unique product characteristics. can this provider conduct new LCAs in the event that you are using unique ingredients, inputs, materials that aren't available in a standardized database, for example? Do they have the ability to be flexible for you? Is this provider going to be providing emissions reduction recommendations? Can you do scenario analysis within your LCA to understand what the actual impact of taking a specific action would be? And then also, around standards alignment, and then also just around making sure that there's, real science that's backing those calculations. So some considerations to keep in mind. And then lastly, when it comes to Planet Forward, just wanted to share again a little bit about us around the fact that we do measurement at the company level and the product level, reduction again at the company and product level. We have a full carbon neutral certification that we offer to companies that work with us, which is an important thing for many consumer brands. And then ultimately also helping on the path to net zero. You want all of this work to ultimately feed up into a strong company level strategy that's truly resulting in emissions reductions across all scopes of your emissions over time. And so that's what we're focused on doing. And with that, I think that we can pause and go over to some questions.
Thank you for that, Kayalin. That was so informative. I learned a ton, and so cool to hear about some of the businesses that are already doing it that I didn't know were doing it. So I'm excited to go to Just Salad next time and look for that label. So we do have some questions, and I just want to remind all our attendees here, if you think of a question you want to ask any of our panelists, Kayalin, Kat, or Michael, you can put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You should see that option next to raise hand normally, where you can type your question in. So I'll start off with the question that we have here from James. James asks, for any of you, are there any coordinated efforts for shareholder actions or resolutions for carbon labeling?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the EU, there's currently a large movement for standardization that's being led by Foundation Earth, getting together all the major retailers and brands there to come up with a coordinated and agreed upon standardized approach for how carbon labels will look in Europe. Europe tends to be a bit ahead of the US on all things related to climate and sustainability. And so we oftentimes look to them as to hopefully where we'll be in the near term. And so that is a function of the fact that climate labels have become very prevalent there. And now people are calling for standardization, and they are actually convening this year on that in particular. Within the US, we're a little bit more nascent in terms of where carbon labels are at, but we do have efforts coming out and about. So there's a number of research institutes that are working on, from NYU to a number of others that I've been in close contact with. They're doing studies on what exactly are consumers responding to best. Just Salad also partnered with Harvard to do a study on the consumer responses to the Just Salad climate labels. So right now we're really in information gathering mode in the US around what people are responding to best and what's moving the needle most around consumer behavior. And then from there, that information will be leveraged to inform the regulations that are in progress. So ultimately, I do believe that there will be, and when I say believe, I mean will work for and am working for a coordinated effort that will be supported likely at the federal level in terms of providing guidance to companies and brands on, what is the methodology that you should follow to do this labeling, what standards should be followed, and any resources that can be provided by public and government groups to brands to help with that, and then ultimately what it should look like. So I think that is very, very close. But one of the first things is I think that the companies that have done it to date are really brave, honestly, in terms of being first movers on this, because it's not something that had been perfectly figured out before they went forth and did it. But I know in my conversations with Jane Frank at Numi, when we first decided to work together to Sandra Noonan at Just Salad and others, their opinion was this needs to happen. And until brands show that they're willing to do it and that it's possible, there won't be precedent to say that it's a thing. So I commend the brands that are willing to be first movers. And I also will say that that means that there's also this narrow window of time to be considered a leader on climate labeling. It's really, once it becomes something that's regulated and mandated or standardized, that's awesome. That's where we want to be. But then it's also going to become the status quo, whereas the companies that are going forth and choosing to do it today voluntarily can really say this is something we did because we believed in it, not because it was asked of us.
Thank you, Kayalin. Michael, Kat, is there anything you want to add about the shareholder actions or resolutions for carbon labeling?
I think Kayalin, from my view, has covered super well. So I don't know if Michael has anything else, but great, super informative, Kayalin.
Shareholder resolutions are really difficult to have the resources to get involved in, right? And so there's certainly some amazing organizations out there that make that their bread and butter of what they focus on. I put a good resource that Series has put together in the chat here. But as someone who has been involved in shareholder resolution filings in the past, I can say that it's not an easy task. And a lot of shareholder resolutions to date, I think, focus on transparency and around the methodology being used for current reporting, as well as around strategy and plan for meeting emission reduction goals. But check out the Series resource that I put in there, and feel free to reach out to us with any questions.
Thanks, Mike. I'll move on to a great question we got in the Q&A. How does climate justice show up in carbon labeling? How does it take into account companies that are reducing emissions, but doing so at the expense of marginalized communities?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think, so one of the ways that ideally this will all work is just being able to dive deeper into a company's climate strategy via their website first. So for every single company that I shared the Planet Forward's worked with, they ultimately have a page on their website which explains their underlying climate strategy and the underlying work that they're doing. There's limited real estate on a package to be able to communicate with consumers around the inputs to any particular calculation. So that's one of the things that we're working through, as you can see, in terms of what's the information that's most, maybe not even most important to communicate, but what can be communicated. And so I think that in general, these are just one piece of a larger strategy, of a larger program, of a larger initiative at a company. And those climate justice should be addressed in every single company's climate strategy, should be talked about, should be shared openly. And so I think we're working with companies to provide that insight in places where they have the space to communicate it, which will probably primarily be through websites. But I think, within package, different companies are doing different things. Moonshot is Planet Forward's own snack brand that we launched in-house. It was the first ever fully climate-friendly snack brand. We make explicit statements on our packaging around the fact that regenerative agriculture were indigenous practices, and we make sure to amplify the role of indigenous peoples, both in terms of being stewards of the environment, protecting the environment, and being the ones who have provided the blueprint as to what needs to happen for us to get out of this. And so that's something that we've made explicit points and goals around sharing and ensuring it is amplified, in addition to having a carbon label on the package. But we call out that regenerative agriculture is the reason that those snacks are climate friendly, and that those are indigenous practices as indigenous peoples that ultimately are the stewards of the land, and those that we're borrowing from and trying to return to a way that things were done around agriculture for generations before really the industrial agricultural system destroyed a lot of that. So ultimately, it's on an individual brand to be able to be a strong communicator of their strategy and to make sure that the values and the way that they move through the world related to climate justice is reflected. I think B Corp does a good job of putting together a climate justice playbook for companies around that, which ultimately says, we're not going to tell you exactly what to do. You need to understand very critically how your company is having negative impacts potentially for other communities, and make sure that you understand what your role is in ensuring climate justice is a part of your strategy. And it takes deep thought. We're not going to give you some sort of bullet by bullet point of exactly what that means for every single company, because it looks different for different companies. So my answer to that is that for some companies, ideally their climate justice initiatives will show up on pack. For some others, it might be something you need to dig deeper to find. And for those that don't, they need to be encouraged to continue to dig deep and to make climate justice a core part of their communications and strategy.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's a really great question, because while it may not be currently showing up very much with regards to carbon labeling, and to some extent, as Kayalin said, there may not always be space on packaging to get too deep into it. But as I think most of us know, marginalized communities are the ones who are typically most dramatically impacted by climate change. And so whether that's on a global level, that countries closest to the equator that may not have as many resources are being disproportionately impacted, despite their countries, their communities contributing less to climate change, but they're being most impacted. I mean, look at Pakistan and the terrible flooding happening there, or on a more local level within the US, that marginalized communities are most impacted, whether it be from heat deserts, or any number of things. So I think that's a great point, and something that hopefully brands and companies will be, we'll certainly be encouraging them to address through their website, through social media communications, through any sort of educational or efforts, or where they're talking about sustainability on their website. But I think it's a great question.
The only thing that I would add to it, and what we're talking about here in the question, there's kind of like, there's two separate things that are maybe what we're talking about, and then what's being seen or what's being practiced. And one being, the practice of declaring something climate neutral, versus I think what we're talking about, which is the importance of life cycle analysis, reporting, collecting the appropriate data to understand the impact that your product is having, whether that be social or environmental impacts that it's having, and reporting that out in a clear and concise way in which a consumer can understand and have a better relationship, honestly, with the product or service itself. So in the strategy and approach that we would be looking for and trying to support, the label on the product isn't the end goal. The transparency of data and the validity of that data, I think, is actually the end goal. So when we start questioning about whether the underlying action that the business is taking is looking out for their impact on environmental justice or climate justice, then we should be able to then in hand turn to the data and see what the data says the impact of that product is. And that's what we would be looking to support.
Thank you all three for your thoughtful answer. I next want to bring it over to a question asked by Jeanette. She asks, have you thought about co-benefits of carbon labeling, for example, through additional labeling for carbon emissions that simultaneously bring about impacts for women's empowerment, using W+ standard or biodiversity, CCB label, or SDG goals?
Yeah, so I think that we're in this really interesting space where I think there's something like 71 different certifications currently that are on consumer goods packages, from organic to everything else. And so really what the goal of carbon labeling is to be able to minimize or simplify this concept of sustainability. Today, there's all of these different claims related to sustainability of products. There's sustainable packaging, there's circularity, there's this, there's that. But every aspect related to the environmental sustainability of a product does ultimately get wrapped up to some extent within the carbon footprint of that product. So biodiversity, for example, would be something that would be impacted by land use change within the supply chain of growing a particular ingredient. If there was deforestation that occurred within the supply chain for your cacao, for example, that's going to have negative impacts on biodiversity, but it's also going to be reflected in a higher carbon footprint due to the deforestation that resulted in and the land use change that went into that ingredient. So while it's not something that is directly captured in terms of being called out as biodiversity, it is something that will have an impact in how high or low your carbon footprint is related to your product. And so there's kind of a little bit of debate, around, and again, brands can choose to do what they want to do. If they want to call biodiversity separately, if they want to call out social implications separately, they absolutely can. But I think one of the goals of a carbon label that's akin to a nutrition label, for example, is to actually simplify the sustainability narrative, to have one measure that people can grow familiar with and therefore are less confused by all of the different competing measures of sustainability. So we can start to move towards a world where people can see that a lower footprint means better sustainability practices, and that's something that's going to drive my purchasing decisions and my understanding of this product. So it's not that I don't believe in co-benefits, but ideally, some of those will be wrapped up into the carbon footprint of a product, and we want climate labeling to be something that people can feel confident that is consistent. But that's not to say that other things are not extremely important, and I totally believe in those as well. But I think that's one of that's some thinking behind climate labeling in particular.
Yeah, I would just say, maybe that there are other places that might be a better suited. Now, not to say there's not specific products that maybe for them, they really want to emphasize a given benefit or sustainability goal, or, how they're working with a certain group for benefiting or not harming a certain group. But in general, there may be other places that are better suited to that. For instance, when we're working on, we offer different projects that are climate positive, and we'll on our website, so not on packaging, we'll list certain SDGs that they may be associated with. And so that's something that those specific projects are wanting to emphasize. So I think, there can be a place for it, but whether that's on packaging or not, I think maybe only in certain cases.
Thank you, Kayalin. Thank you, Kat. Mike, is there anything you want to add there? Or are you good?
No, they got it covered.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions that we have from our audience. Are there any final thoughts, any final remarks, resources you three want to share?
I would just say that hopefully coming out of this, that we'll all be supporters of the brands that are doing carbon labeling. And if it is something that you're interested in doing for your company, then definitely reach out, even if it's just to ask questions. I think another big part of all of this is to say that, again, people are trying to make this work. And so even if you're in a place of not understanding it completely, it's completely fair to be there. And so I'm always willing to talk about it and always willing to chat. So if you're interested, just reach out. I dropped my information into the chat, but it's been so great to be here with you guys and Kat and Mike. So thanks for having us.
Yes, I also dropped my information into the chat, and thank you especially to Kayalin. I learned a lot from your presentation, and Tulasi for having us. So feel free to reach out if you want to connect further. And also, if I'm not mistaken, all four of us here are going to be in New York for Climate Week. So anybody who's watching this live or recorded, watching a later recording of it, feel free to reach out if you're interested in connecting while in New York, or maybe we'll just bump into you at different events happening around the city. So thank you again for the time.
Great. And, we promised to put some subject matter experts in front of you guys, and we're lucky to have both Planet Forward and ClimateTrade as part of the ASBN membership. So really hats off to both of you guys, and thanks for your continued engagement as members and being not just members, but leaders on this important topic. And I look forward to working more on the business case study that'll be coming out soon, and future conversations around the importance and policy implications of carbon labeling. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, thank you all three. I put in the chat the link for where you can find a recording of this session later today. So if you want to share this with people who would find this interesting or relevant, please share this recording with them. They can learn as much as we did today. And we're also having our ASBN conference in San Diego, November 30th to December 2nd, where we'll be probably talking more about this. Let's see. So definitely come join. We'd be thrilled to see you there. Thank you all for being a part of this. Thank you attendees for being here today, and hopefully see you at the next ASBN Live. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.